Residential Library and Museum. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. We have a great program. I'm really excited about it. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. For those of you who are watching streaming, if you would like to type your questions into the chat, we have someone locally who will be answering those or giving the questions to our speaker. And for those of you in the room, if you want to write your question on the notepad that's on the table and hand it to either me or Jeff, we'll do that for you. And I am very grateful for the support of the Eisenhower Foundation. It is through sponsorships that are donated to them that we can do these lifelong learning programs. So let me introduce the speaker and we'll get started. We're very excited that Dr. Jennifer Ifft, the Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair at Kansas State University. She's an associate professor in extension and an extension specialist. Wow, that's a hard one, for my accent at least. She has an integrated research and extension program that covers policy and regulatory issues that affect agricultural viability. She's currently working in the areas of non-traditional finance, crop insurance, farmland markets, and farm labor. She also regularly publishes in the farm press and works with farm sector policymakers and stakeholders. Before coming to Kansas State University, she was an assistant professor at the Cornell University Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management and worked in farm economy. She has degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, University of Cambridge, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she grew up on her family's farm in central Illinois. Please help me welcome Dr. Jennifer Ifft.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Good to see some purple as well. So I'm going to start off my talk providing some context. I really like the theme of difficult decisions. Sometimes economics is called the dismal science, and we think everything is a difficult decision, or we think of everything in terms of trade-off. I'm also going to talk about the history of foreign policy before the Eisenhower era. It's hard to understand what happened during that period if you don't know what happened before that. And then I'll go through some major policies of that era and conclude with what's happening in foreign policy today. My next slide. Right. Next slide. So first of all, how do I think about agricultural policy? The way that I think about this is that it's about shared problems in agriculture. These are problems that require cooperation between individuals. That cooperation that an individual or problems that an individual can't necessarily solve by themselves. These problems might be based on physical realities. I teach agricultural policy at K-State. I tell my students the aquifer doesn't care what political party you're in. Aquifer depth is a physical reality, but a lot of times these shared problems are about shared values as well. If you could think about agriculture and our food supply, we want to have a safe food supply, a sufficient food supply, and addressing hunger at home and abroad is also a shared value. Another shared value is supporting farm families in rural communities. So we do have the political process, so people might have different ideas about what important problems are, which ones should have priority, and how they should be solved. But at the end of the day, still a lot of shared problems in agriculture. So I'd like to go a little bit more into detail into each of these. If you could move to the next slide, please. So first of all, fighting hunger. We have a lot of programs, food stamps, it's called SNAP today, that help address hunger domestically. And a lot of the policy debate around this is centered on, do you focus on maintaining incentives for employment on one hand, while reaching the people you need. On the other hand, for some others, the focus is on us reaching as many hungry people as possible. So having a wide a wide net for eligibility. So that characterizes our current policy debate. The U.S. is also does a lot of international aid, international food aid, and a lot of the debate on that is balancing objectives related to diplomacy or foreign aid, security interests versus domestic interests. One of the big debates right now is, should we require U.S.-owned vessels to ship food aid? More of a political issue, but it's much more expensive to do that, but the shipping lobby is fairly strong. So, a lot of policy debates there. Move to the next slide. Another shared value is protecting natural resources. So, earth, air, water, a lot of natural resources, the soil are shared to one degree or another. So the impact of resources used in agriculture often goes beyond the farm gate. The challenge here is using these resources for economic growth, protecting income, while at the same time making sure that natural resources are protected for future generations. Next slide, please. So next, another shared value is the well-being and economic stability of farm families and rural communities. As an agricultural economist, this is where I do most of my work. And the big challenge here is providing financial support or assistance with risk management while not distorting markets, not making things worse. Historically, the problem was avoiding large government-owned surpluses. So I think most of you heard of government cheese. So during Jimmy Carter, during his when he was running for president, promised higher prices for milk, and it was implemented, and dairy producers responded, and a lot more milk was produced in response to those higher prices. It takes a lot of milk to make cheese, so that's what happened. There was a surplus of cheese that ended up being stored in caves near Kansas City. So, as an economist, that's something we're concerned about. If there's a government policy that changes markets, is that ultimately going to make things worse? Or make the objective very expensive to achieve? Now, the government, well, there's still a little bit of commodity purchase, but it's very small. The government's largely gotten out of the business of purchasing agricultural commodities, but it's still very involved in risk management. So some of my research looks at the federal crop insurance program. Does this cause farmers to increase investment, say in land or machinery, and is this investment efficient or not? So this is an ongoing challenge. Move to the next slide, please. Okay. So next, I'd like to give some historic context of agricultural policy before the Eisenhower era. First, if we go back before the Great Depression, before the 1930s, the role of government could largely be characterized as provision of public goods and building institutions. So, you think of building roads, building railroads, developing laws, antitrust laws, food safety laws, development of research institutions, development of the extension system. So government was involved in a lot of aspects, but government wasn't providing a safety net. Government wasn't involved in risk management, and government largely wasn't involved in providing support when farm income dropped. And this was largely the political philosophy of the time. It's not to say that there wasn't groups that wanted government to play a larger role in supporting farm income, but they weren't the majority. So there was such a strongly held belief at that time that the government had no role in this, that it was the job of private individuals or private organizations. And this view was held by the majority until the Great Depression, when there was so much suffering that the political attitude, public attitudes changed and policies changed. And this wasn't just in agriculture, it was also outside of agriculture, if you think of the New Deal. But in terms of agriculture, government started playing a role in food aid, so helping households access food. There was a surplus of production at the time, so government was making payments to farms for reducing production. The government started purchasing, in some cases, and storing commodities when prices were low. There's also payments related to conservation practices. So during the 1930s, the federal government became much more involved in agriculture. And a large part of this, and this is going to be important when we talk about the Eisenhower era, was through supporting higher prices, but also storing commodities or paying for lower levels of production. So this had helped farm income to some degree by the end of the 30s, but what really made a difference was World War II. So ended up being shortages of commodities. There's actually food rationing. And the approach went from trying to get rid of surpluses to promoting production. So that was for agriculture was it was a high price period, relatively prosperous. Can we move to the next slide, please? So at the end of World War II, I think both sort of in the general public and well as legislators, politicians, people like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they understood the dangers of price supports and stockpiling. That the government could end up with surpluses of agricultural goods, but there was also, on the other hand, a lot of pressure to maintain support prices, to keep farm prices high, to support farm income. However, there were some, what was then considered reforms in 1949. So the 1949 Farm Bill gave the Secretary of Agriculture discretion in setting support prices. So these are prices that you could sell your crops to the government at, within a range. So if there was a large supply, they could pay a lower price. Where supplies are short, they can pay a higher price. But the Secretary of Agriculture did have some discretion. I'm going to get a little bit, I'm going to get more into what parity is later, but the big point here is the 1949 bill gave more flexibility in dealing with agricultural surpluses and price support. But then you had the war in Korea. And because of that, price supports were set at a higher level. There was an anticipation of shortages. And so a little bit of a movement away from flexibility to higher government support prices at that time. Now we can move to the next slide. Okay. So now we're getting into the Eisenhower era. And if I had to summarize the political debate at that time, I'd say corn versus cotton. This is a little bit of a simplification, but it really does summarize what happened. It was a southern cotton interest versus a Midwestern corn. And then wheat was the other group at what Western wheat growers wasn't quite as big, and they might work with either group, initially cotton. But the cotton growers in the South wanted to maintain high support prices and production controls. The corn growers in the Midwest, they didn't want production controls, and they were willing to take more flexible or lower support prices. And interestingly, we still have this. We still have this today to some degree. Now in Kansas, we have a decent amount of all three crops, so this might be a good place to have compromises. But that was when Eisenhower was president, there was fierce political fights between corn and cotton interests. We can move to the next slide. Now, if I had to summarize the Eisenhower Administration, again, this is a simplification, but they were mostly on the side of corn. That they're very much against higher support prices, didn't want to have as many production controls. This was consistent with the stance of Republicans that tended to be more against production controls. However, in terms of the farm policy, especially during this time, it wasn't necessarily about the party. It was about your regional interests. So, and the Democrats were stronger in the South at that time. So Southern Democrats would have been on Team Cotton. And you can see this in Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson. He was described as a zealous economic libertarian and also being against the New Deal farm program. So he wanted to have the government less involved in setting a higher price and less involved in controlling production. And so what they were pushing for was flexible and lower loan rates. Now, if you read about farm policy, you're going to keep seeing this term loan rates. And that's what it was at the time, but you can really think what it was practically is a price support. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that's sort of the policy mechanism for providing a higher price. If you ever see loan rates, it's a price support. We move to the next slide, please. I'm not sure how big you can see this. I can talk to it. So I want to talk about the technological environment during this time. And it's important to understand that there was a lot of improvements in productivity going on during the post-war period. Large increases in yield. And there was a lot of reasons for this. You had improvements in machinery. The seeds were getting better. You had increased use of pesticides. You had increased irrigation. And over the next several decades, agriculture became much more efficient. So if you look at this chart, it goes from 1948 to 2017, and the bottom line, the flat line, is inputs. And this is an index. So the amount of inputs used relative to the amount of outputs, that's the line that's going up. That went up, and inputs remained constant. These are absolute amounts, these are indexes or relative amounts. So if you want to think about, one way to think about it is today, we can produce 3 times as much with the same amount of inputs as we did 60 years ago, 70 years ago. So agriculture has become much more productive. One thing this does is lower the cost of production. Move to the next slide. Another important thing to recognize is that farm structure was changing, or you could say that rural life was changing. In 1950, there was over 5 million farms. By 1970, there was 2.7 million farms. So the number of farms was cut in half over 20 years. So I grew up on a farm, and sometimes when I think about this from a personal perspective, is this good or bad? So I know when I was growing up, if somebody had to get a job in town, that was not seen necessarily as good. Like that you had to move away from the farm, that you had to give up your way of life. On the other hand, I was born at the beginning of the 1980s farm crisis. My parents always wanted me to go to college, to have a better life. Farming was hard. Farming was risky. So I think there's some sort of tension there in terms of how I thought about it, that you didn't necessarily want to have a job in town or have to stop farming, but we were encouraged to go to college and get off-farm jobs. But one thing I want to point with all these families, the number of farms declining, the economy was growing at this time. There was a lot of opportunity off-farm. So this was a big change in rural communities and rural life, but it also represents a lot of opportunities outside of agriculture. And that a lot of families were able to generate more income off-farm. You also saw an increase in farm size during this period. The land farmed since the 1900s has been pretty constant. So this is aggregate. You do see some land coming into production, other land going out, but total land and farms has been the same. But definitely during the Eisenhower era, farms were getting bigger due to technology and off-farm opportunities, while there was less families involved in farming. Go to the next slide. So before, I talked about parity prices. So what is parity? It's really driven up by an idea that prices, or a value, that prices should be fair for the farmer. So, one definition, if you could use a bushel of wheat to buy a pair of overalls in 1910, you should be able to use a bushel of wheat to buy a pair of overalls today. Now, prices were really high during that period. 1910 to 1914 was considered the golden age of agriculture, and that during this time, the farm sector was considered to have received a fair share of the total income in the economy. So, parity is really about a standard for giving a fair price to farmers, and this held a lot of sway through the 60s, and it was a big political battle during the Eisenhower era. And if you're thinking, what would parity mean today? Today, commodity prices are about, in parity terms, are about 20 to 40% of what they were from 1910 to 1914. So if we had parity prices, the price of wheat and corn might triple today, and the economics of production would completely change. So, can we move to the next slide? Okay, so apologies if there's no economist in the room, but I did, as an economist, I did want to use a chart to provide some intuition for what happens when you have price support and technological change. So if producers are becoming more efficient, their supply curve is going to shift out, so that's S1 to S2. People are going to be willing to produce more. Cost of production is going down. And if you hold all else constant, people produce more, that lowers the price. However, if you have price support, people are going to produce even more than they would have otherwise. So on the bottom, Q is quantity, so you're going to an even larger quantity than you started at. So technology is going to cause you to increase production. Price supports are going to cause farmers to increase production. And in a lot of cases, you're going to end up with more production than the market can handle. And it's not going to solve itself. Because of this, when you have these kind of price supports, a lot of times there is some type of supply management policy where the government is involved in the purchase or storing of commodities. Move to the next slide. And this definitely happened during the post-war era. So the demand related to World War II had gone down, technology was improving, and the government was largely maintaining high price supports. So you had a buildup of government-held stocks. The black shaded one is cotton, green is corn, and red is wheat. So this was a real policy issue during the Eisenhower era that the government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was trying to address. Could we move to the next slide, please? And as this happened, there was a concept developed by economists called the technology treadmill. So you had producers that were early adopters of new technologies, and they were able to increase their yield, have lower production costs, and benefit from that at current prices. But then as you had more and more farmers adopting this technology, your supply is going up, prices are coming down, and you could be in the same place that you started. Or you just have to keep adopting new technologies, keep investing. Everybody does it, prices come back down eventually. It's a treadmill. And this is, if you're producing commodities, it doesn't have to be agricultural commodities, but you make money by producing it at a lower cost than other people. So there is pressure to keep your costs down to maintain profitability. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this was the economic, political, technology environment going into the Eisenhower Administration. And if I had to describe legislation during the Eisenhower era around agricultural policy, I'd say it was a grind. It was a lot of debate and a lot of compromise and not much change. Now, Eisenhower did have a united Republican government when he started. However, again, with agricultural policy, a lot of the differences, disagreements, were regional. They were based on commodity specialization, not on what party you were in. So the 1994 Farm Bill, that was a compromise, a difficult compromise for price support from 82.5 to 90% of parity. Now, Southern Democrats, King Cotton, was really arguing for 90% of parity. That was something that they were really sort of fixed on during this period. So getting it down to 82.5 was a compromise. That was a win for the Eisenhower administration. However, if you think back, 1949 Farm Bill gave flexibility to 75%. So it wasn't quite didn't provide as much flexibility as the 1949 bill, but it was the result of a compromise. And so during this debate, Eisenhower had to use his veto. He also used it in the debate around the 1956 Farm Bill, Agricultural Act, known as the Farm Bill. And that's somewhere where he really, as I was reading about this, he really stood his ground. There was some, I think, concerns that the Farm Bill debate and this moving away from 90% of parity led the Republicans to lose some votes and lose the House. That it may have contributed to that. But he continued to use his veto through the debate around the 1956 Farm Bill. And this, I think this consistency led to a move away from a focus on 90% parity and such high support prices moving into the 60s and 70s. The 1956 Farm Bill was another compromise in terms of flexible support prices. But there were some new programs. There was a soil bank. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So it was trying to manage the supply. A food stamp program was also authorized. So this was supported by hunger advocates in Congress, as well as ag interests that wanted to increase demand for food, for agricultural commodities. However, the Kennedy administration implemented food stamps. It wasn't implemented by the Eisenhower Administration. There's also funds for research into new uses for crops and donation of surpluses. You move to the next slide, please. If we could get a little bit more into the politics of that era. Again, there's very difficult compromises during this period, not different from today necessarily. And a lot of conflict in the agricultural committees of the House and Senate between corn and cotton interests. The language, the Senate Ag Chair is a part of the debate. So the Secretary of Ag is woefully ignorant, talking through his hat. And there's complaints, from the South. The corn grower will get a bonanza. So concerned that one commodity was going to end up better for the others. And this last one, I think, really sums up. Eisenhower is very concerned that of agricultural surpluses, about the farm income support system, that this wasn't a good way, an effective policy. But it was a grind. Trench warfare is the term that one author used. In Congress, it was very difficult to get cooperation on any, even relatively small reforms. So, if you could move to the next slide. So some of the policies that were able to get passed had to do with both increasing use of agricultural commodities and also other policy objectives. So you had this Public Law 480, known as Food for Peace today. And so there was support from this because it could help with diplomacy, national security, but also it was a way to dispose of surplus commodities. This law still exists today. This program is still used. But when it started, there was three components. The first, the U.S. government would sell surplus commodities to foreign governments at a concessional or lower price. And then sometimes they would donate the proceeds from this back to the government in their local currency. So that was one way. Sometimes the commodities would be donated to UN agencies or private aid organizations, and they could use those commodities or they could sell them to fund development work. There is also just donations or grants of U.S. commodities to foreign governments. You move to the next slide, please. So this law contributed to a large share of international food assistance. And most of it, in the beginning, was under concessional sales. So the U.S. is selling our surplus commodities to foreign governments at a lower price. There have been several updates to this, amendments, and today, most of the work under this is under this Title II. So donations to UN agencies or private aid organizations. It's still the largest international food assistance program that the U.S. does. So whenever there's a major global conflict, this Food for Peace, this law, that started during the Eisenhower Administration, is what's still used to make food donations. So if you think of, say, the conflict in Sudan, they received a lot of food aid through this program. Although it's substantial in this aspect, it is a less than 1% of farm bill spending, and it also takes up a very small share of crops that are produced in the U.S. So It has large local impacts, for sure, but in terms of the share of U.S. commodities it takes, or the share of government spending, it's quite small. Move to the next slide, please. Next, the soil bank. This program, the soil bank, was a part of the 1956 Farm Bill, and it was something that the Eisenhower Administration worked hard to promote. There was two parts of this, something called the Acreage Reserve Program, as well as the Conservation Reserve Program. If you're involved in agriculture, the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, might be quite familiar to you. But when it started out, it was mostly this Acreage Reserve Program, which was short-term, where land was taken out of production for 1 to 3 years. So it's sort of temporarily paying farmers to take land out of production. Remember, there was concerns about surplus production. So this was what it was used for in the beginning. It was mostly wheat and corn, as well as some cotton. So if you look at the chart, that's the red, green, and black. But in later years, by 1959, it had moved to the Conservation Reserve Program, which paid for taking land out of production for a longer period of time, up to 10 years. Could we, next slide, please. So at its peak in 1960, 6% of U.S. cropland was enrolled, about 28 million acres. This is in the Conservation Reserve part of the soil bank. And a lot of this was a truly land retirement. The land that went into the Conservation Reserve Program in this period never went back into production. So this was sort of marginal ground, low-yielding ground, highly erodible, not terribly suitable for agricultural production. And in a lot of cases, it allowed farmers that were making a living in these areas to retire and move out of agriculture. So because of this, there was an impact on production, but because it was for less productive land, and because yields continued to increase, there wasn't a huge impact on production or surpluses. There were some environmental benefits. This was several decades ago, so the environmental benefits weren't studied or documented as well as more recent environmental programs, but there was evidence a lot of this land was planted to trees and remained that way. The last year of new contracts was 1960, and it was paid through 1973. The Kennedy administration did not continue it, but it was could be considered the precursor to the modern Conservation Reserve Program, and that started in 1985. So this program does continue to have an impact. If we could move to the next slide. Although it is important to note that it was controversial at the time. I found one headline from Time magazine, The Soil Bank, a $700 million failure. And now part of this, I think, there were some criticisms that were, there was some criticism based on facts, and there was also some criticism that were based on these regional differences with corn versus cotton. The cotton or southern interests were never that much behind the soil bank, so they were really gunning for it. But again, the short-term contracts to take land out of production, that was not politically feasible. In terms of environmental benefits, farmers, if you only had a short-term contract, they were less likely to invest in conservation practices. There was also some claims that payments were made in 1956 when planting had already happened, that it was used strategically during the election. That's hard to verify, but there's definitely claims being made. or that people were buying land. There was speculation trying to get these benefits. So the USDA did make some changes to CRP that allowed the program to enroll out of acres. So they did increase the payment rates to make them more attractive to producers. However, they made sure that they weren't too high relative to land value. So they didn't want people to be buying land just to have access to these benefits from this program. They also allowed producers to enroll their whole farm, and there was an incentive for this. So in 1960, 70% of acres were from an entire farm. So if you get back to this helped farms that were, they were making a living or subsisting on low productivity land, they were able to enroll in this program and retire from agriculture. They also allowed farmers to bid or compete to get entered into the program at lower rates. So when the USDA made these changes in the late 50s, it did allow there to be relatively high enrollment in the early 60s. You can move to the next slide, please. So where are we today? So the food stamps, which were authorized in the 1956 Farm Bill, were implemented by the Kennedy Administration, and today it's known as SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's an important part, or a large part, of the U.S. social safety net, and it's also an essential part of the Food and Farm Bill Coalition, that you need hunger advocates, SNAP advocates, you need legislators that support these programs to be a part of the Farm Bill, to pass the Farm Bill. So, and that's widely recognized. There's still a lot of political debate over this program, over the size of it, over the scope of it, but it's a big part of farm and food policy today. Next slide, please. So environmental programs have become a large part of the Farm Bill. There has been an increase in spending, and most of these, there's several different types of environmental programs that are part of farm policy, and for the most part, they're voluntary. So you have the Conservation Reserve Program. It's not growing anymore, but it pays for a large share of environmentally sensitive land to be taken out of production, and there have been benefits for erosion and other environmental benefits documented from that. There's something called conservation compliance. So this is if you want to maintain eligibility for some federal benefits under the Farm Bill, you're not supposed to farm on highly erodible or very environmentally sensitive farmland or wetlands. So it is, it's quasi-voluntary. You could not take part in the federal programs and do what you want, but if you want to benefit from some of the farm safety net programs, you have to do, not farm the most environmentally sensitive land. There's federal programs called Working Lands Program. And these pay farmers who are actively farming, so crops or livestock, to adopt different conservation practices as a part of their production. Recently, there was some additional funding approved through the Inflation Reduction Act. The Biden administration has also started some programs which can broadly be referred to as climate smart programs. I have a question mark there because those are still being rolled out. We're not quite sure what they look like. Could move to the next slide. In terms of farm policies or policies that support the economic stability of agriculture, of farm families, it took a long time for the federal government to get out of buying and storing crops. And they didn't there were some reforms in the 70s, smaller reforms, but the big change came in 1996. where there's a farm bill called Freedom to Farm. And today there's almost no production, there's no production control, no acreage allotment. But the government is still involved in risk management in agriculture. It's called the Federal Farm Safety Net. And so there's crop insurance programs. There's what are called commodity programs. So there are programs that make payments when prices drop. However, these payments aren't based on current production, they're based on historic production. So that makes the incentive to, used to be called plant to the program. So producers are more likely to make decisions based on market prices. And then there's also disaster programs. So that in the early 2000s, commodity prices plummeted. There was a lot of payments made to farmers. During the trade war in 2018, 2019, there was a lot of payments from that when commodity crop prices dropped. And during the COVID pandemic, there was another round of payments made because of all the instability in markets. So the government is still involved in supporting agriculture and decreasing risk for producers, but the government's out of the business of storing commodities, of really mandating any type of production decision. Next slide, please. Okay, to wrap up, in terms of what can we learn or what was accomplished during this time, first of all, the past is ever present. We still have debates between commodities. There's still concern about farm income. It's still difficult to make policy. And so, I think it's important to remember that these challenges aren't new and they have roots in the past. The other point, the first one, in terms of reforms or changes, sometimes this happens very quickly. Policy changed very quickly during the Great Depression. But a lot of times it's a grind, it's very slow. And I think, that's what happened during Eisenhower's presidency. That, his administration understood the problem with surplus of farm policy driving a surplus of commodities. And they wanted to change it, and they, he made those vetoes. They might have been politically costly, but they probably played a large role in that movement away from the government being involved in storing commodities. So, for me as somebody who works in agricultural policy today, the farm bill sometimes moves very slowly. Change happens very slowly with policy, and it's very motivating to see that sometimes you just have to kind of stick with it, and that's what I thought was impressive about what Eisenhower did. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ifft. We typically do question and answer at this point. We tend to give everyone a moment to think about what questions they might like to pose, but I have one while we're waiting for people to sort of formulate their own questions. You mentioned about the great farm yields post-World War II. We know that Eisenhower had the set of criteria, perhaps, that he thought we needed to do to maintain a global peace. And he felt that making sure that people were fed was one of those things. So my question is, which came first? Did the farm yields come first and he had to figure out what to do with it? Or did his idea come first and then there was a supply to send around the world? Sorry, I know that's a history question, but I posed it anyway.
I am an economist. I'm not a historian.
I know it's a
might
history
answer
question.
that like an economist.
I'd listen to an economist answer.
I think it makes a lot of sense that maintaining yields is important for hunger. So your question was which comes first?
Yeah, did he find himself with a great amount of food and he thought, what am I going to do with this? Oh, we need to feed the world. Or did he say, we need to feed the world, let's get some more food?
The yield increases were happening already. There was a lot of factors that contributed to that. some of it was from research, some of it was from private innovation. The overall some of the technologies. My understanding is some of the technologies developed in the war were being used. So there was a lot of factors driving those increases in yield.
Okay. I mean, he was a smart man, so who knows? We have one question online, and I'm standing closer for the microphone. What effect did Eisenhower's use in rural America have on his policy decisions?
I'm not familiar with that program.
I just think it means with any of his policy decisions. Did him growing up in rural America affect the way he thought about his farm policies, his agricultural policies? I'm sorry, you came to a history museum, so you get history questions.
I would think so. He seemed very, he was very engaged in agricultural policy. He understood the economics. He has the great quote about, someone here probably knows it, the pencil.
Pushing the pencil.
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about farm policy when you're pushing a pencil rather than pushing a plow, something like that. Samantha's going to find it online and show it to us in a second. All right. I don't see any other questions online. I'll go ahead and read it. Is there still a corn versus cotton dynamic occurring nowadays?
Yes. The 2014 Farm Bill was supposed to be the 2012 Farm Bill. I think it gave Senator Roberts all kinds of headaches. He was a big part of that. But there was two reasons why it took so long. One was that some people were trying to separate food policy from farm policy. And that makes it very hard to pass the Farm Bill. The other part of it was there was a change in commodity support policy, and there was debate. So Southern crops wanted reference price. They wanted price supports. They wanted a minimum price. And the Midwestern interests wanted price supports based on the average of income over the past 5 years. So there was two different types of policies that were being debated. And what they ended up doing was putting both of them into the Farm Bill and saying that farmers could choose. And that's some of the extension education that we do today at K-State. It's helping farmers figure out, do they want the income, the support based on the average income over the last 5 years, or do they want support based on a reference price, which is like a support price, it's set in legislation. And so that was a big part of the debate, was those regional differences. I think generally Southern crops have had a lot of influence in driving the Farm Bill historically and today. And the price supports, the subsidies they get tend to be a larger share of their income or their margins. But there's a smaller amount of acreage than, say, for corn. So they have certain interests in maintaining high price supports. It continues to be a debate. I think if you had either commodity had complete control, farm policy would look pretty different, but you keep having compromises. I do want to emphasize that there's still price support, but they're not linked to current production. Something called base acres, and this was a big farm policy reform. So you get these payments when incomes are low, but they're not based on what you do today. And so that helps with the issue of surpluses a lot.
Thank you. Samantha actually did find the quote for us. It's from a 1956 speech at Bradley University in Illinois. You know, farming looks mighty easy when your plow is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from the cornfield. Good quote. And we have another question. Which U.S. state or states show good leadership in adapting and following through on new farm policies?
Adapting and following through. So the policies are federal. I would say in terms of, so in terms of having influence over farm policy, this is a different question.
This is your question, or David? You want to, would you like to
I can answer
elaborate?
in terms of the role of universities or extension. I think farm policy is implemented by the Farm Service Agency. I don't think there's much of a difference from the state. University of Illinois, Texas A&M have a lot of influence on farm policy. K-State historically. Iowa has strong extension. University of Missouri.
Strong land grant college.
Yeah, makes a difference.
All right, we have another question. I had not known that SNAP food benefits are part of the Farm Bill. What other types of legislation get included with farm bills?
Oh boy. So, SNAP nutrition programs are about, if you look at the total size of the Farm Bill, 75 to 80%. And these are relatively small benefits spread over millions of people. And then you have the farm programs. I'm trying to think through. So, there's the conservation programs and the sort of say commodity support, crop insurance. That's the next largest share. We talk about the 1% in farm policy. Research, rural development, support for universities, support for the extension system, support for new and beginning farmers. So there's a lot of stakeholders in the Farm Bill now that make up a pretty small share of total spending.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any online. Any other questions in the room? All right, join me in thanking Dr. Ifft, please. Thank you so much for being here with us today. What a great talk. Thank you again. I'm going to give you some comments about upcoming programs for a moment. On April 11th, our evening program, we have Mr. Scott Finney, who will discuss saying no to a close friend, President Eisenhower's decision not to support British military intervention during the Suez Crisis of 1956. That sounds super interesting. I can't wait to do that one. And on April 27th, for our lunch program, our guest speaker is Dr. Edward Keeper, and he will be discussing Eisenhower and the Korean War armistice. So those are two to really look forward to. Once again, I need to thank the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Coate Memorial Foundation for their unending support of these programs. And I'd like to say thank you. Have a great day. Yeah.